Well, greetings from Ottawa. As you hear me, don't adjust your volume. Nothing is wrong with your speakers. It's just me that sounds a little different. I am currently rather ill, and so one of the benefits, I suppose, of teaching like this out of the comforts of the internet is that when days you can barely get out of bed, you don't really need to. So I'm currently just recording this from my house, and I have a very bad cold. So if you see some pauses and breaks, it may be for me to top up my cold medication or try to deal with some sinus pressure. I hope it doesn't sound too different, that it's not off-putting. Today we're just going to have a little look to review our excerpts and finish up our methodology section. A final chance to reflect on what a different set of perspectives gives us when we consider all of them together, as we now have both historical sources and recent examples of attempts to work out and feel through just how people make decisions, how people map out the decision-making process from a Christian perspective. We'll have a good handle on how that's done by a variety of people. You've probably now been able to identify a particular author that really speaks to you, that gets not only your writing style or thinking style, but has some of the same presuppositions as you. And that's sort of a natural thing. People in a variety of contexts, or even people in the same context, by dint of personal aptitude or inclination, will just fall into sort of different ways of wanting to make decisions, different, slightly varied opinions over what may be the good, and even slightly different interpretations of what exactly it means to be a Christian. So let's first of all just talk about a couple other things that should be happening right now. You have all now ideally read through the entire methodology section, because comparisons in between the texts and the excerpts are a part of the assignment that I hope most of you will have submitted by Friday evening, which is, as I have been reminded, but left my mistake up for posterity's sake, February 1st. So I'm hoping that we all have an assignment completed by February 1st, or perhaps in the few minutes after that. As I've stated, though, both in the discussion boards and to several of you via email, if you do not have it in, I understand and will not assess any type of late penalty, because I gave some of you the false hope that you would have until March the 1st to do it. So while future critical reflections will suffer if you do not get something submitted on time, and if you do not tell me that you do not request an extension, which I may or may not grant based on the circumstances and especially how much advance warning I get. That said, since I know some of you thought that you had until March the 1st for this, there is no consequence, at least from a grading perspective, of you getting this particular critical reflection in late. So to do that, you'll just use the critical reflection submission box that you see listed under the week 2 methodology content module box. That gives you the option to upload a file. I then get that file and the notification that you've submitted it. If you do not get that in by midnight on February the 1st, then email it to me directly. Those are the two ways. Going forward, the idea obviously is that the Dropbox is the definitive way to submit things to me, because it has built into it a deadline machine. So you can upload files until that last minute when it's due, which will usually be at midnight. And then once that happens, or once you submit it, or if you fail to submit it, that option disappears. So, with that said, I look forward to reading a lot of these critical reflections as you send them in to me. I know that the ideas that I've heard from you have been very perceptive in the ideas or the concepts that you've seen in the two sides. So the excerpt text synthesis is something that those of you who have reached out to me get. I appreciate that. And that type of ability to make connections is precisely what is going to inform and help you develop a more rich and complex type of reasoning when it comes to seeing how people make decisions and what ideas they hold dear in the decision-making process. So just to look at the excerpts of modern authors and to see some of the critiques that are brought both by Gill and that I hope we can notice in ways that we can connect that, I want you, especially in listening to what I have to say, think about going forward what it means to offer criticism. Because by criticism, by a critique, I don't mean that we are looking to build an argument to definitively say why someone is wrong. Because often the type of moral reasoning that goes into these ethical frameworks is very difficult to pin down in a way that says definitively, this is wrong because. There may be some false premises contained in the reasoning of people. There may be some unwarranted conclusions based on otherwise valid premises. And that can make an argument invalid or weak. But what we were saying when we criticize is not that something is false. That doesn't mean there aren't certainly times where you will encounter ideas that are patently false, where opinions are put forward, perhaps in pieces that you consider for your op-ed analysis. There will be ideas that are used that are just factually incorrect, or are arguments that where the answers or the resolutions do not follow from the premises in them. So you can say that this is a wrong argument, but looking at someone else's ideas and just saying that's wrong or that is not enough is in itself a sort of lazy rebuttal. And this is one of the reasons why they say never look at comment sections on the internet, because more often than not, to offer a significant, meaningful, thoroughgoing criticism of an idea requires almost as much, and in some cases perhaps more work and more thought than the issuing of an opinion. So for people that very clearly have baseless or infantile opinions, sometimes it's just not worth the work. And the danger then, or the tendency, is to not actually do the work and respond to someone's stupid assertion with a simple and stupid response. Well, that's not the way things work. This may have its place on a playground, may have its place shouting at people who think they have the better sports ball team. My local sports ball team is clearly superior to your sports ball team, and then da. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about issues that have some real significance. So when we offer criticism, when we're going through and using Gill's method, what we can do now, and what hopefully you will just be beginning to understand, is how the particular components of our setup allows for a nuanced criticism of an author's ideas. So what that means is that when we understand the background of when or why someone is writing, we can better assess perhaps why they gave weight to some ideas and not to others. Obviously, someone who experienced significant trauma in their life, for someone who is a survivor of domestic abuse, for someone who has had a family member die in an accident with an impaired driver. These people, owing to their background, will very heavily weigh particular parts of their personal story in the creation of an argument. And I don't think that is invalid, but by recognizing how and where this happens, we can understand just why they do it. So to give perhaps, let's say, a less emotionally charged one than whether or not someone has had a family member killed by a drunk driver, to provide a background analysis of one of the very first times I discovered the way in which, let's say, hidden or unacknowledged factors can influence the way that decisions or ideas are presented. When I was a child growing up in New Brunswick, I remember very well one day, not a child at this point, as a teenager, one of my first jobs involved working in the downtown of the city of Fredericton as a tour guide. And when I was there were some people that were going out and about giving out water bottles, and they had cones, sort of like, miniature pylons, and they would set up basically impromptu examples of bicycle safety and especially helmet safety. Now, I was not a rebellious teenager, but one of the few things that really got under my skin was the incessant way in which helmets were foisted upon people. See, I remember as a young child, helmets not being a requirement for bicycle riding, but during my life, the province of New Brunswick mandated the wearing of helmets by any person riding a bike. And this is any person of any age. For those of you that live in different parts of the country, you may not have to deal with that at all. Most parts of the United States don't require helmets to be worn. In Ontario, where I am now, helmets are legally required for minors. So anyone under the age of 18 is legally required to wear a helmet. Above 18, it's at the discretion of the rider. But you're also, strangely, legally required to have a bell and a light, which is not something that is required in New Brunswick. There, it's only a helmet. These types of arbitrary rules struck me, even at that time, as strange. But here's what happened when I went up and I talked to the people doing the bike safety training. They were giving out clearly talking points. There were statistics of who suffered traumatic brain injuries when they were involved in an accident as a cyclist. And I asked them at some point what a particular little logo on the bottom of the water bottle meant. Because as they were giving out these statistics, there was very much a public health emphasis. However, they told me that the acronym was the name of the company that was paying them. And it was actually the Provincial Association of Insurance Brokers. So all of the work being done to enforce the newly enacted helmet legislation, which seems like a matter of public good, was, perhaps to the cynic's eye, actually a form of risk mitigation being demanded by insurance companies. Because, well, helmets, how should I say this diplomatically? Helmets quite often do not save lives. That's not to say that this never happens, but again, speaking anecdotally with n equals 1 in this sample size, I have known 3 people personally who have been killed in cycling accidents, and every single one of them died wearing a helmet. But what is true is that wearing a helmet does help make a more distinct separation in between accidents which would be fatal regardless of the consequences, and accidents that would be not fatal but perhaps lead to the type of trauma that would then require extensive therapy or medical attention for a person's natural life. So this is, again, not to say that helmets are good or bad, but that obviously a variety of jurisdictions have a variety of opinions as to when you should wear helmets. But getting to the background of why these people were making claims, were encouraging a course of action which seemed to be noble and in the interest of the public good, became much more suspect once I understood that the background information, who's cutting the checks, was an insurance company. This is exactly the reason why at the end of most academic papers, whether they're published in the arts or sciences, there is a disclaimer which signifies whether the author has any vested interest or financial interests. It names funding sources for studies, because the idea of a conflict of interest is always lurking in the background of anyone who's putting out there ideas which are deemed to have a type of normative or certain value. So Gill takes us through doing those steps. We see first, and then after, key issues, what types of ethical arguments get used, the basis of this explicitly Christian component of these ethics, the social determinants, and then the social significance, and then finally a criticism. That system, that way of looking at things trains us, whether it's looking at a newspaper article, whether it's how we run into the pamphleteer giving out bike security pointers. When we encounter people or institutions making claims or giving advice, these steps are training us. And so let's get right down at some of the ideas that you may have seen. Actually, I say you may have seen. I'm going to give you just a little bit of a tip going ahead through this. Because the very first time that I read through this textbook, I read through it one time. And the second time in preparation for this course, I realized that sometimes it can really help to, in each and every chapter, not read necessarily everything backwards, but the critiques that are found at the end, I think it's good to read those critiques first, because Gill is a trained, skilled ethicist, so he's able to pick things up right away in terms of the internal incoherences or inconsistencies of an author. You might not, but by knowing what to look for, these things become more apparent. So, the way it's structured right now in the book is you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the initial steps, and then the text, and then right at the end, that's where Gill puts the critique. I think that especially for your first times engaging these ideas, read through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then read the text. So with that said, there are a couple of the criticism that Gill makes that hopefully now you've seen, and some of them group together in a way that will be brought to our attention throughout the rest of this course. And so, by way of example, one of Gill's criticisms of the Bonhoeffer piece is that for Bonhoeffer, if we have no prior knowledge of God, then how do we accept the truth of Christianity in the first place? This is the epistemic, which came first, the chicken or the egg argument, that plagues any and all people ascribing to a type of Barthian neo-orthodoxy where revelation is the fundamental way in which God communicates. So natural law, or the idea of there being a sort of common grace baked into the fabric of the universe, is almost completely absent from the neo-orthodox position. And so it becomes God's revelation, predominantly through Scripture, but also through the man Jesus, that is how we come to know what the Christian life is and what the claims of the Christian faith are. Now, the issue with that is that if there's no way that we can if there's no prior knowledge of God, how do we access the revelation? How can we even pick out what is the divine from the not divine? Why is this text, why are scriptures, why is this man Jesus the one through which revelation comes? So that becomes difficult, and Gill's right to pick that out. Now, the other thing that plagues any account of Bonhoeffer's ethics is the fact that in his high academic abstract opinions, there's a very real sense in which the dissociation of humans from God means that actions of you or I can at very best be a way of creating a conscience that just helps us to not alienate ourselves from ourselves. So this is that twofold structure where there is an irreparable break in between creator and creation because of the reality of sin. And it is only by dint of the revelation of God that we, in broken creation, we as broken humans can ever even come to know what God is, that God is. And there's this secondary level of brokenness that is the dissociation of a person from themselves. So sinful actions actually make us forget who we are. And in that system, because God is good and actions are only good insofar as they relate us to God, there's no such thing as a good thing apart from the life, the redeemed life of a Christian believer. That is Bonhoeffer's position. And yet, when he tries to do a good thing, and by this I mean murder Hitler, he plots with people who are not Christians. He plots with the equivalent of secular humanists over and against those who would call themselves Christians in the Reichskirche. And so while he's willing to say, on the one hand, in academic pieces, that there is no good apart from Christian belief, he comes to an idea of what the good is and then shares that idea with people who are not Christians. So that idea that a person's or a theorist's ideas work well in a book, but when the rubber hits the road, that does not always obtain, is something that we want to think about very strongly when we consider Bonhoeffer. Anytime you see a piece from Bonhoeffer, think of that. But more than that, there is a perhaps more famous account of this type of difficulty managing one's intellectual ideas and practical works, found in a group of thinkers that would broadly be considered the intellectual vanguard of mid-20th century French thought. So when we encounter figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and also Jacques Derrida, although he's sort of a later contemporary, there was, during the period, let's say the 1954. This is why it's helpful to do a little bit of editing on your own with some of these videos, so I don't misspeak. But specifically, from 1954 until 1962, the country of Algeria, so it had been known as Algiers prior to this, fought for its independence from France. This was in the struggle of the decolonization of the world. And while there was a varying degree of willingness on behalf of the colonial powers, France would not let Algeria go without a fight. And the fight was utterly brutal. There was frequent use of what we would now consider to be terror tactics by the French government. There was torture used both on Algerian citizens and French dissidents. It was a nightmare of a conflict, a truly evil act, because this was all in service of maintaining an empire. And this conflict was something that deeply spoke to those involved in the intellectual life of France's elite institutions. So, in this conflict, we have a remarkable conflation of figures, pardon me, including, but not limited to, Albert Camus, who was himself born in Algeria, Sartre, born in France. Then also Jacques Derrida, who was himself born in Algeria. And factoring into the names, the intellectual names involved in this, we have Frantz Fanon as well. And although Fanon was originally from Martinique, he served in Algeria during this conflict, working in a hospital as a psychiatrist. So within these figures, especially earlier generations of French philosophers associated with what we would now call existentialism, there was a deep suspicion about any moral claim, especially a normative one. Even saying something like torture is bad would have been simply a language game, or perhaps a culturally conditioned practice that is generally seen by people to be bad for society, but not evil in and of itself. So these positions, which were held in the abstract by French existentialists, were challenged deeply by the realities of the widespread use of torture and non-sanctioned tactics within the Algerian Civil War. And Sartre took a stand against these practices and became essentially an anti-war public intellectual in France. So even though he was not one of the individuals born in Algeria, he spoke most fervently against the conflict and against the French government, and was in many senses abandoned by his intellectual compatriots, who held that his strong moral convictions were out of step with his philosophical leanings. So that was spelled out more explicitly than the type of consequences or the type of conflict we encounter in Bonhoeffer's ideas, but it's a similar case of a great mind being confronted with a great evil and having to modify their intellectual framework in order to incorporate what they believe is the right course of action. So, fantastic little account of how and when sometimes being flexible seems to certainly serve the good better than any form of intellectual purity or rigor. And I said that we could in some way group some of these criticisms together, where we see in Bonhoeffer, not before the idea of his willing to change his ideas, the first criticism that I mentioned was that if we have no prior knowledge of God, then how do we accept the truth of Christianity? And in the next excerpt, so when we see in Fletcher appeals to agape, or even Capet's appeal to social ethics, these also don't have a strong epistemic grounding in the same way. So for Bonhoeffer, the idea is, if we are waiting for revelation to learn what is good, how can we even know how can we pick out revelation when we see it? So the grounds that we have for understanding what is right epistemically are absent from their theory. And similarly, for Fletcher and Capet, the grounds of understanding just what is agape. You can't, after you develop this theory, say, we and all of humanity are called to neighbor-centric, other person love, but it's not simply the Pharisees that ask, who is my neighbor? The attempt to define what a neighbor is and what agape is not rigorously performed, not only not in these excerpts, but in Fletcher's work as a whole. So there's this hand waving that happens when it comes to saying, well, all right, so we have these moral maxims which are illuminators, and we then seek to bring about the most love that is possible. But do we simply take it as a given what love is? Is this idea universally held? The answer is almost certainly no. The very nature of agape is a cultural construct. So with that, there is that same tension of how do we know, both in terms of what is revealed and what is a priori knowledge. This is an ongoing difficulty in any type of ethical model. One other thing that's not brought up, and I wouldn't even say this is a criticism in a negative sense, but this is the type of observation that I think is a positive critique. I saw a lot of your comments about the earlier texts, and I share many of the concerns that we come across. So when Augustine was writing about Cicero, the language that he uses it would be unfathomable today to see that type of insult hurling be a part of an intellectual treatise, supposedly academic work. It is polemics by any other name. And even Luther, while perhaps not in this piece so much, but Luther, as I've said before, speaks about people in similarly terrible terms, usually scatological. But we don't find that here. And so one thing that very much changes from both the medieval, pre-modern, all of pre-modernity, let's say, versus the modern period, is that through the shift that has come about via Enlightenment understandings of reason as being largely a procedural one, rather than reason being something baked into the universe towards which we use our rational minds to navigate ourselves towards reason. Whew, that was tricky. We're going to get a bit of a discursus here. So hold the thought on the reason and the calling people funny names. One of the things that happens to the understanding of reason during the Enlightenment, or perhaps more properly, during the beginnings of what we now understand as the scientific revolution. So just prior to the intellectual enlightenment of letters, but from the writings of Newton and Bacon, we begin to see reason applied with an understanding that the universe itself is ordered, explicitly so. And because the universe is ordered, our own thoughts and actions can mimic these patterns to discover the order of the universe. So this begins as a synergistic understanding that is not unlike what existed in the classical world. Because within the classical understanding of reason, there is in fact not just an order to the universe, but that divine reason, or the cosmos, is almost a supernatural quality. So reason is a force in the universe in the same way that luck would be a force in the universe, or nemesis, so revenge, retribution. These are cosmic forces that just weave in and out of the fabric of the universe. And our job as mere mortals is to align our minds towards these rational things. And if I fail to align myself towards the universally apparent reason or universally accessible reason, it's not so much that I fail to be reasonable. It's not so much that I make missteps in my argument, but rather I'm an idiot. I mean, just plain and simple. So when we encounter Augustine talking about Cicero, what's happening is he's calling him an idiot because it should be plainly obvious to Cicero and any and all other Roman politician, or even to Stoics, no matter how great or reasonable they may seem, that reason is right there in front of them. Reason is on display in the universe. And so if their mind fails to grasp what is immediately apparent, they must be stupid. So the ad hominem attack is uniquely available in the pre-modern world as a rhetorical device to show sort of isn't this obvious? And from there, if something is not obvious to you, you must be stupid. But after the Newtonian and Baconian synthesis of the two, that says not only is the universe ordered by the divine mind, but also that in order to find what that order is, it's not simply that I turn my mind towards this order, but I use ordered steps to weed out the possible influence of sin and finite or lackluster thinking. Reason becomes less about becoming aware of the obvious ordering of the universe, and rather a procedural process that through step taking, through the logical construction of arguments, weeds out any possible moments where human weakness or fallibility or sinfulness can get into the cracks of what had been reasoning before. So reason as a type of aligning your mind or thoughts to the way the world works, versus reason as a procedural way of taking the steps to make tiny claims and then prove those claims. You see and hear the echoes of the scientific method in this, obviously. That model of reason is probably one of the most effective changes in rhetoric to building a solid argument that we as human culture have ever produced. So I'm all for not having any more Johnny Calvin's a poo-poo head comments, because what we get is far more charitable people. So when we read things today and we see name calling, we say, oh, this is an ad hominem attack, and that has no place in a well-constructed argument. So instead, I will read my opponents generously and give their ideas the benefit of the doubt, and still, using my procedural reason, take the steps to demonstrate the ways in which they are wrong while still reading them charitably. Sounds great, right? It may have its own separate problems, but that is a different philosophical argument. One thing it definitely does is make good readings much more pleasant to read. So, I say that now because hopefully you all noticed through this week that, wow, Fiorenza is, talking about an institution that denies her equality with men, that denies her the right to ever possibly be ordained, often makes it very difficult for her to teach in any academic settings, and yet the way in which she is able to speak as a Catholic woman about the Roman Catholic Church is really fairly charitable. It's firm, but it's charitable. And that difference is, let's say, a positive critique. This is the useful observation. And I hope that you are all able to pick up on it, especially after some of the nastier bits from last week. I think those ideas get to, let's say, most of what I want to say. You've had a chance to now see the past, the present, And if you have specific ideas that I didn't bring up, you notice something that you wish had been critiqued in the pieces, let me know. I will be able to engage each author more directly when we are dealing just with Aquinas, Luther, and Augustine than when there is a large chunk of excerpts like this. But if you still have questions about these, because I know that I didn't touch on Abraham today in this video, and that's simply because there's not much time. You all have lots of things to be doing, and I like to keep this to about 40, 50 minutes. So today, those ideas, really the difference in between the ancient and the modern, the continual presence in methodological reflections and in every single excerpt we'll see of which comes first, chicken or egg. Do we know the good and then try to do it? Or does God teach us the good and then we are enabled? That back and forth that affects the Bonhoeffer piece, that infects Cuppet and Fletcher, is going to remain important. And so is the tension in between the ideals of a concept and the practical applications of a concept. So that might have been embodied in a Bonhoeffer or embodied in a Jean-Paul Sartre, but it will be embodied in more and more of the figures that we get in touch with. And then we have this interesting secondary level of moral reasoning, not only what is good and what is not good, but sort of what is good and then what is possible. There's a type of political evaluation, moral triage that seems to happen almost inevitably in limit cases like a conflict zone. And limit cases are a particularly interesting way of talking about moral issues. They can also be a canard. When we talk about war, you'll start to see some ideas that you've probably heard in barroom talks or given it as weak examples. Well, if this happened and if you had the gun and you had to shoot, and the answer is, or the truth is, most of us will never have the gun and most of us will never have to shoot. And so the type of moral reasoning that you and I have to do is more often about things that are less consequential. So we are afforded the chance to be less we were afforded the chance to be less flexible. If that seems strange, like wouldn't flexibility be a desired thing? And oftentimes flexibility is very difficult to live with. Having to live in gray zones morally and do that reasoning is tricky. We are cursed with the ability to be black and white. So that seems like a bit of a head scratcher, and I hope you continue to scratch your heads this week. What does it mean to be cursed by the ability to live in a black and white moral world? So think about that now, after you've had a chance to contribute something to the discussion, reflecting on these excerpts. This is now the week when we turn to our next module. So you should all have books by now. I think there may still be one person who does not have a text that, unfortunately, the library has not told me that they have their copy yet. I think it's in transit, so perhaps even this week they'll have that. But this week we're going to be turning to politics and justice. And if politics are the art of the possible, we will do what we can to confront just what it means to make the best possible decision and evaluate whether Aquinas, Luther, or Augustine thought that the best possible decision was actually a good one. So the readings for this week coming up are the Politics, Economy, Justice section, Part 1. So we're looking at Augustine, Aquinas, Luther on those subjects. You should all be submitting your three-page critical reflections. If any of you are as sick as I am, you should also be getting lots of sleep and eating lots of soup. So with that said, have a wonderful weekend. Or if you're watching this on a different day, whatever day it is, I hope it's a good one. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available by phone, email, or find me in the comments section. Have a great day.